Recently, I published a video where I described myself as a non-resistant non-convert to either Eastern Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, even after several years of investigating these things both inside and outside of academic settings. Predictably, that sparked some comments, and while YouTube comment sections aren't known for being breeding grounds for nuanced intellectual thought, there were a few diamonds in the rough. Specifically, there was one conversation that really stood out to me that we're going to be talking about here today. Many people expressed that my line of thinking that I talked through in that video, in which I mentioned that I haven't been intellectually convinced by certain claims by the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Church, citing that I didn't feel there was sufficient evidence to prove the historicity of these claims. People were saying that that line of thinking could lead to kind of spreading out into all of the Christian faith, that could lead to a greater skepticism that ultimately leads to Agnosticism. In fact, several people in the comments said that having looked into Catholicism or Orthodoxy as a Protestant and found the claims lacking, they ended up turning that same skepticism on their own faith and becoming agnostic themselves. In a similar way, several converts to Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism said that they recognized that during their journey, the same questions that were keeping them Protestant could easily lead them to agnosticism, which, at least in part, helped them choose to become Catholic or Orthodox to avoid agnosticism. So in this video, I want to address that dynamic as well as the implications of taking the alternative leap of faith into one of these traditions. So whether it's Trent Horn's book, When Protestants Argue Like Atheists, or Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation, the general line of thinking that Protestant principles can lead to or mirror more skeptical worldviews has been well documented. Again, in the comments of this video, there seemed to be a general sense that placing too high of a burden of historical proof on doctrines like the bodily assumption of Mary or the apostolic origin of iconodulia could, when applied in the same way to core Christian principles and doctrines, lead to agnosticism. And if I'm being honest, I can understand this, especially for people like me who have spent several years diving into these topics and failed to find the neat and tidy answers that I've been looking for. It can be pretty frustrating. And if you're not careful, you can allow this same frustration to spill over into the rest of your faith and wonder if there's really reason to believe any of it at all. It's not a good place to be. And while, for the record, I believe that the evidence for the resurrection of Christ or the deity of Christ is better than the evidence for the bodily assumption of Mary or the apostolic origin of iconodulia or the papacy or various things I mentioned in that video, I do understand how this could apply. And I grant that the evidence isn't overwhelming for some of these foundational Christian beliefs. I'm not an apologist, so this really isn't my area of expertise if I had one in the first place. But while I find the evidence for mere Christianity personally compelling, I also recognize that my personal belief in Christ is a lot more complicated than saying I objectively looked at the evidence for various truth claims and came to the conclusion that Christianity is in fact true. It's not simply inquiry and hard evidence and rationality. That's just not how faith works for me. It's much more complicated than that, and there's a variety of factors that go into this mysterious thing that we call belief in God. And personally, I couldn't fault anyone for looking at the same evidence I've looked at and coming to a different conclusion than me. I wouldn't say that they're inherently irrational people. So if it's possible that the same line of historical inquiry that keeps Protestants from becoming Catholic or Orthodox could also lead them to become agnostic, is it then not better to just make a leap of faith and join one of these traditions and buttress your faith with the confidence of 2 millennia of ancient tradition and church witness? Indeed, it does seem like that is the case for a lot of converts. It seems that they might have some struggles in their faith, and then in joining one of these traditions, their questions are answered, and they no longer have to wrestle through these things individually, but they can say, the church teaches, and I trust the church. And it's a liberating thing for many people, if I can tell from my interactions with them. And before I go further, let me say I begrudge no one who chooses this path. For many, I think it might even be the right path for them. It leads to a deeper engagement in their faith, and call me a relativist, but I think that's a good thing. And when I see people taking steps that deepen their faith and their love for Christ and love for neighbor, I'm happy. But I don't believe this path is without its drawbacks. In my experience, many people who convert from Protestantism to Catholicism or Orthodoxy have personally long since settled the question of their belief in God. For them, this conversion is a matter of simply going further up and further in. They're already engaged members of their church and mature Christians. My concern, though, lies in what this leap of faith requires for our increasingly post-Christian world. As an outsider to these traditions, the multiplication of the dogmas considered necessary to be part of that tradition, or even in some cases just to be considered a Christian at all, is difficult. It may be easy for some seasoned Christians to simply trust the church and believe in these dogmas even if they would admit to themselves that empirically the evidence isn't really that great. But what does it mean for an outsider? Because it seems that we're raising the barrier of entry to the Christian faith. Now they don't have to just believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, who was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, died, was buried, and rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. I mean, not that that's it, but like they now have to believe a whole lot more. And these things, in my opinion, seem to stretch credulity a bit. Not that Christianity is only about minimizing the number of theological doctrines or making it as easy as possible for outsiders, but I don't think we want to make it unnecessarily difficult and make people have to believe things that, to me, at times feel like they aren't strictly necessary in order to become a Christian. Many will say that I'm approaching this in the wrong direction, and I understand that. The argument goes that you don't settle each dogma and then come to trust the church. Rather, you come to trust the church and then all the doctrines just simply fall into place. But surely if one is making an initial judgment over whether the church is authoritative in the first place, the credibility of what it has infallibly declared comes into view. And if the credence of many of these beliefs is low, well, then that affects the credence of the church's authority. The two can't really be separated fully. It seems to me that both situations present difficulties. Nowhere does this seem more clear to me, though, than when I think of passing the faith down to children. Now, Eliza and I have not been blessed with children at this point, but it is something that I greatly desire, and I think about what it will mean to pass the faith on to our children one day, Lord willing. And that's when these two paths really come into focus for me. On the one hand, the critique of Protestantism is that an overly rational approach can lead to theological minimalism, which lacks the weight of a robust system and tradition. Its teaching can sway in the wind with the times too quickly. And as we've seen with mainline denominations, it can be a question of, in 30 years, will these churches even be teaching the same faith? Others would say that the reforming principles lead to it going too far and ultimately leading to a skepticism of the entire faith, as we've been discussing. These are all real concerns, and as I think about what it means to be a parent, I can see how these things could one day maybe adversely affect a child's faith. But on the other hand, the critique of Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy would be that in multiplying dogmas, whether that's the 7 ecumenical councils or more extensive magisterial teachings, then if any one of these are wrong, the system collapses. Thus, its greatest strength, namely its deep tradition, can become its greatest weakness as well. When these doctrines rise to the level of dogma, for instance, and I know the Assumption of Mary gets picked on a lot, but when you raise it to the level of a dogma, it takes on equal weight to the system as all other things. Now, hear me, I'm not saying it's as theologically important, but since it's been infallibly declared, if it is in fact untrue, well, then it does pull out the bottom card in that way, right? Because if one thing that the church has infallibly declared isn't true, well, then it actually isn't protected from error. And then we can't just simply trust the church and other things are going to come into question, but it affects and infects the whole system. So if children grow up to say, wait, is the Assumption of Mary really true? Or did the apostles really teach the veneration of icons? The weight of the entire tradition is hanging in the balance, and that seems a bit precarious to me. While they have the beauty of this deep tradition and thousands of years of witnesses, it also seems to be very capable of falling down with just little doubts in a way that maybe Protestantism wouldn't, because you could question these things and it would still be okay. You'd still have the basic principles. Now look, I have no easy answer to these questions, and it must be said that, like, strictly speaking, these aren't questions of truthfulness of these traditions, right? They're questions of the practicality of these systems and which approaches might be most beneficial. Now, of course, if it can be proven that one of these traditions is true, it doesn't really matter what its drawbacks are per se. They just kind of come with the territory. You kind of just accept that it's true, downfalls be what they may. But outside of that kind of certainty, I think these questions become a bit more relevant because we're now asking, I don't know for sure which is true, and I think it's very difficult to say that we ever have certainty on something like this. And so the questions become like, well, what are the relative merits and what are the relative difficulties that comes with either of these approaches? And on the one hand, we have a faith that I think can withstand a few more questions because it has dogmatized less, but it also has a little bit less robustness in terms of its culture, in terms of its depth in these ways, and it might have its own principles turn against itself at times, as we've been discussing. But on the other hand, I worry about a house of cards. Now, I'd love to know what you think about this. As I said, I'm not going to settle this today, but there are things that are top of mind for me, and I realized, quite joyfully actually, that many of these things are top of mind for you by reading the comments on the last video. So I hope this spurs your thinking, and maybe we can continue the dialogue in future episodes. Anyway, thanks, and God bless.